In my last video, we went over how to create a gradient, which is when a value slowly and gradually gets darker so that you can't find any seams, which is different than a value scale, which is broken up into shapes. In this video, we are going to learn how to use our different values and gradients to create the look of a form, specifically a sphere, that looks three-dimensional through the use of light and shadow. First, we just need a new piece of paper, and we need something circular that you can trace. I'm using a roll of tape, but something like a can from your kitchen, a can of food, works really, really well for this. My first step is to place down my circular tracer, and with a light pencil, I'm going to use a 3H. I'm going to trace a circle. So there I have my circle. This is the shape that we're going to base our sphere off of. I'm going to start with my HB pencil. That's going to be my first step. And I need to start shading one side of the sphere. But the side we shade is dependent on where our light source is, because the placement of the light source will determine where the light hits the sphere. I'm going to place my light source right here on the right side of the sphere. If the light source is on the right, that means that the shadow on the sphere will be on the left, because the light source hits this side of the sphere. So with my HB pencil, I'm going to start very lightly shading this middle section of the sphere. I'm using my small circular strokes. If your pencil strokes are super visible, you are doing it wrong. Remember, shading is a longer process. You cannot do it quickly. If you try and do it quickly, it will look really bad. So I'm going to shade out my middle section. And I'm not putting a ton of pressure on my pencil. And I might start drifting my shading a little bit more towards the bottom as well. This shading is going to continue all the way to the other edge of the sphere. I'm making sure that my pencil marks are smooth, and I'm using an even value across my sphere. And then I can start bringing the value down a little bit towards the bottom, but not quite to the edge. Then I'm going to take my 2H pencil and I'm going to start shading above the shadow that I just created. So my pressure should be nice and light on my pencil. And here's where I'm going to start to kind of curve it. The idea is to create a circular shape. So I start to curve up my value. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to grab my 4H. And I'm going to very, very lightly shade in the inside of this circle. The smaller your circular strokes with your H pencils, the better. Because the graphite in H pencils is harder, they're much more likely to create visible pencil strokes. So as you can see, I've left some white space here. I'm going to come back to that area later. It's not done yet, but for now, I'm going to switch it up and I'm going to grab my 2B pencil. And in this area where I began, I'm going to start shading and making that area darker. As I drift out towards the edges, let up on the pressure of your pencil so that there's a gradient is still there on the sphere. A mistake a lot of people make when they shade spheres is they will have like lines of different values. But spheres are completely smooth and curved, so you never ever want to see a clear divide between different values. They always need to have a gradient. Notice that I'm still curving my value at the edge. And we're just going very, very light along this bottom edge here. Next, I'm going to grab my 4B pencil and I'm going to continue to shade along this curve. So before I was working on my midtones, my shadows that aren't too dark, and now I'm starting to build up my core shadow. As I get toward the edges of my core shadow, I'm really holding up on the pressure on my pencil so that I can have a smooth transition still. Next, I'm going to go straight to my 6B, and I'm just working in this small area now because the darkest part of the core shadow really is not very big. And again, I'm being careful with the pressure on my pencil. I'm lightening up along the edges of my core shadow to make sure I have a smooth transition between values. Make sure that your hand isn't getting into the shaded areas of your sphere. You don't want to create smudges. Notice that I'm going back over areas multiple times to make sure that my value is dark enough. Shading forms, it's all about your layers. Just continuing to layer graphite on top of each other so that your values are dark enough. Now I think my core shadow is dark enough. So I'm going to go back to maybe my B value pencil, and I just want to start adjusting my gradient a little more, darkening some of my shadows a little bit that are above my core shadow. Just another light layer of graphite to help the surface look a little bit more curved. Shade a little bit more down below. I'm going to switch back to my HB again. Get some of the highlights just a smidge darker. At this point, I'm just barely touching my pencil to the paper. At this point, I'm just looking back over my whole sphere to do any touch-ups that are needed. And then I'm going to grab an eraser, and I'm just going to clean up the edges of my sphere a little bit. I always prefer to blow my eraser rather than brush because I don't want to smudge my pencil. And my last step, I need to create my cast shadow. So I'm going to start with drawing my shape of the cast shadow, and I'm going to use an H pencil for that. Cast shadow goes under the sphere, away from the light source. So the light source points this way. That means the cast shadow also points this way. And I just gave myself a little guide. And then I'm going to grab my 6B. I'm going to start shading really, really dark right along that edge of my sphere. You'll notice this is where you can really start to see my reflected light along that bottom edge. Your cast shadow is going to start off really, really dark, so use a lot of pressure, go as dark as you can go. And I'm starting to pick up a little bit on my pressure. And I think I'll switch to my 4B. I'm finding the edge of my shadow along that side. Edge along this side of the cast shadow. As I'm going off, getting further and further away from the sphere, I'm starting to lighten up my pressure. Remember, I'm keeping it a gradient, I'm keeping that transition smooth. Then I think I will switch to my 2B. And then my HB. Maybe just wrap it up with a 2H. Remember, I like to turn my paper just so that my hand isn't getting into my pencil. And there we go. We have a shaded sphere. The one last thing for you to do is I want you to label each part of your sphere. So here we have the light source. We have the highlight. We have mid-tone. We have core, shadow. We have the reflected light. And we have the cast shadow. Remember to do these labels because this will come up in our quiz on value. Follow these directions and you will create the perfect shaded sphere.